Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about certain key areas in Total War Warhammer 3 that Creative Assembly should look to improve before the release of Lords of the End Times, or maybe alongside the release of Lords of the End Times DLC/expansion, because these do affect the campaign experience. And on top of that, these kind of issues are also teaching players, new players, the wrong things. It might be a very frustrating experience to figure out what works and what doesn't as a new player, because you might think, oh, I'm just going to recruit an army, right? And units might be the same tier, so of course that army is going to handle equally well, right? Well, beyond the specifics of how different units handle in combat, there is the problem of Autoresolve. See, Autoresolve heavily depends on armor. Now, of course, there's many different things. Things like armor, leadership, unit ranks, unit types as well. Things like giants, single entities, take a huge amount of damage in Autoresolve. Things like trolls don't, which makes Strong's campaign completely ridiculous. Now, over here, I can get a decisive victory because these are goblins. These also have a low level of armor. So even though my guys mostly have 0 armor, I am going to be able to steamroll through them. People have asked me about Warzak, how his campaign dynamic is given, Autoresolve. Well, the reality is it's pretty fine, not because Warzak's Autoresolve is great, but because his enemies have just as bad Autoresolve, with maybe some exceptions, but not necessarily that many. So, due to the fact that the Autoresolve values certain units versus others, people are going to gravitate to those units of their specific races. Like, for instance, with dwarves, Iron Drakes, one of the best things to do on any difficulty if you're playing dwarves is actually just spam Iron Drakes. If you're playing Skaven, Warp Fire Throwers, and so on and so on and so forth. Like, if you're playing a Khorne campaign, you almost never want to use Bloodletters, not because Bloodletters are bad units in combat, though one can make an argument between Exalted Bloodletters and Chosen, but rather simply because of their Autoresolve situation. And look, very few people want to fight every battle in a campaign. That's one of the most tedious things that has ever existed in Total War history. And for the record, it is better in Warhammer 3 than it has ever been before, but it's still frustrating. But even worse than that, even worse than the field battle situation, is the settlement battle situation. See, when you auto-resolve things in settlements, it actually is worse because every single settlement in the game, major settlement, minor settlement, whether or not it's a field battle type settlement, or simply put, walled or unwalled settlement, every settlement in the game has an auto-resolve benefit. Now, in this case, it's not necessarily that big of a difference. I would be able to win this battle either by fighting this army here or fighting the settlement, but I will absolutely take more casualties because I am attacking the settlement. And just for a record, if I was fighting these battles manually, I would absolutely win without any kind of real opposition. So, not a good system, not the kind of incentive structure you want to create for a player, because it means even with thematic legendary lords, you kind of just want to go for units that are going to do better in auto-resolve. So for instance, it's better for me to recruit Orc Spear Boys than it is to recruit Savage Orcs right here. Though not necessarily the biggest and most important thing when you're playing a Warzak campaign, because suffice to say, the enemies you're dealing with the exception of Kroq-Gar, they are not really a big problem in terms of that. Though they are absolutely still an issue to a certain extent or another. I mean, we could also talk about how it's far more rewarding to fight field battles, how they're far more fun and interesting, and also the fact that field battles give you more rewards because of the post-battle loot option. So, settlement battles inherently are the worst kind of battles that you can fight in a campaign, and that's without the shadow of a doubt. But then we also have to talk about sieges, of course. That's the second part when we're talking about settlements. First off is, of course, the auto-resolve aspect, then we actually have the siege battles themselves. Sieges, the one part of the game that Creative Assembly promised they would improve, and then didn't. They even did the proving ground for it. Honestly, there's kind of a mod right now that actually does have better siege layouts. And there is also a mod that removes the penalty for attacking settlements. So, to be quite honest, I think the problem with sieges is not just the settlement layouts, though that is absolutely part of it. See, you have these towers in every settlement, and these towers can and will do a good amount of damage against you. So what do? Well, you either have artillery to destroy them, or you just mass your entire army on a small section of the walls where they can't hit you. Yes, this is as fun as it actually sounds. Now, some people will take, oh, you should play things like this. Well, ultimately, this is not a fun situation to be dealing with regardless. And really, you may not even care too much about one particular tower or another. Like, you can take fire from one of them and just soak it up. But two of them or more, yeah. Thankfully, in this particular case, we do have a wall breaker unit in the Giant, which is one of the few changes that Creative Assembly did well with regards to the Tides of Torment. But all the same, pathing issues, AI issues, also the AI just sitting on its ass, even if they have a massive army. In this case, they don't. But even if the AI has a 40-man army inside a settlement, they'll just sit there and get destroyed from a distance. And even if you don't have range units to be able to destroy them, they'll still lose in that specific situation simply because, well, when your forces are fighting in a really bad and stupid fashion, it does tend to hurt you quite a bit, suffice to say, in a siege. In fact, many people have found that it's actually better to just kind of sally out of a settlement instead of fighting to defend it, which is kind of defeating the purpose, right, of why we would even want to fight the siege in the first place, or why sieges exist even in the first place. I mean, it is just one of those really silly, ridiculous things. You want one of the key objectives, regardless of which difficulty you're playing on, but one of the key objectives you have as a player on any difficulty is to reduce your casualties, because that prevents other factions from easily declaring war on you, because your faction strength does dictate whether or not factions will be declaring war on you. For instance, so if you're weak, if you've taken a lot of damage with your forces, there's higher chances that enemy factions will be declaring war on you. That's the easiest way to get steamrolled, really, by the AI in a campaign. I mean, this kind of situation, if you will, is like, the gameplay here is not fun, it's not engaging, it's not in any way, shape, or form a fun dynamic to deal with. And oh, by the way, remember what I said about the armor situation? Well, the thing is, in a lot of field battles, when you have units with low armor, you can kind of deal with it. Also, you know, you have cavalry, you have magic, you have flanking maneuvers. Well, some magic doesn't work in sieges. Lots of units are good in field battles, but not good in siege situations, and so on and so forth. Sometimes the AI does sally out, sometimes, very rarely, like once in a million damn years, they might sally out, but you first have to draw them out. So sieges end up kind of like this stupid game of like, how do I get the AI to attack me so I don't have to chase them into the middle of the settlement? And that is not a fun dynamic. People talk about like how you should need to build siege equipment, and I'm like, that's not the problem with sieges. And also, the fact that you may have needed to build that in, say, Medieval 2 is not what made those sieges good. The reason sieges ended up being better in Medieval 2 is because you could abuse a lot of different things. Not abuse. It's because the defender had a genuine advantage from defending a settlement, as opposed to the attacker having one. Like, the thing is, you're playing a lot of these sieges as the attacker, which means you will almost certainly win battles you should lose. You would even lose in terms of a field battle. But if an enemy army turtles in a settlement, or if, say, there's multiple enemy armies around the settlement, guess what I'm going to attack? If it's a walled settlement, not a field battle, I'm going to attack the settlement because I know the armies, the garrison, the force inside that settlement is not going to do anything. So it's different aspects. The buildables are not great. The towers are not great. The Autoresolve is not great. The AI behavior, the pathing, the layout. It is a difficult thing to resolve. Absolutely. I mean, people have talked about, like, allow us to deploy just outside the walls to use these wall towers. That's something, by the way, that happened in historic sieges. Like, if you look at many sieges throughout history, and in fact, even fiction, you see the defenders constantly sailing out, constantly trying to force an opponent before they scale the walls. Because a lot of actual sieges, in both fiction and history, were decided right on the walls, not inside the settlement. Like, you look at Helm's Deep, you look at Minas Tirith, the most casualties, and we're using fiction, let alone history, because it's the same thing in history. But you look at Minas Tirith, you look at Helm's Deep, the vast majority of the casualties inflicted by the Gondorians and Rohirrim were before the walls were breached. Once the walls were breached, that was GG, well played, more or less, in both cases. And that's also something that applies in history. You look at sieges like Vienna, Constantinople, etc. Like, that's the thing that defines a lot of those kind of sieges. And that's maybe what Creative Assembly should focus on, as opposed to the bad fantasy that doesn't even apply to actual fiction we have. You look at the Battle of Blackwater, you look at Helm's Deep, you look at Pelennor Fields. Do you know why we call it the Battle of Pelennor Fields? Because it was fought in the field. In fact, in the books, there are very few attempts to even scale the walls. Like, they break down the gate, and then Rohan arrives, and then the rest of it is on the field. That's why we call it Pelennor Fields. Anyway, that's the second issue, and yes, it's a big issue, but then we also have to talk about the campaign map. So with respect to the campaign map, there are some areas of it that are good, but there's also plenty of areas that are not. The entirety of the jungle, be it in the Southlands, or Lustria, or even Cathay, the jungle design is not exactly great. But especially in Lustria, you have a lot of these settlements that are choke points. Imagine what happens when those settlements get raised, especially by a Khorne faction. Oh! Does Khorne have an incentive to raise every settlement in their path? Yes. Does it suck to play a campaign as Skulltaker in Lustria? Yes. Because of that. Like, think of this settlement right here. It is on a choke point. If you raise it, you lose a lot of movement range and turns trying to move past it. And that's just one example. You look at Tlangshala, you look at the floating pyramid, you look at multiple settlements, we have the same situation. Or Bretonnia, filled with provinces with only 2 regions of minor factions. Now, one could talk about the Old World mod, and look, I love the Old World mod, but the Old World maybe goes a bit too far. Like, it has like, what, 300 or so factions? I like the idea, but there you have 2 great distances in certain areas and empty areas, so you end up playing a lot of enter and button simulator there. That is a problem. There's things I really like about that. Skaven Blight, for instance, I really like there. Kislev, Zarnagrund is freaking amazing, but maybe not necessarily that far, but absolutely more than what we see in many areas of the campaign map. So I do believe that campaign map and many portions of it do need a significant redesign. Provinces made bigger, or parts of it like Bretonnia or Kislev made larger. And look, the ability of changing a map is there, and I'm not going to argue it's like, oh, it would be too hard. A modder made a map that is much bigger than this, with a lot more settlements and a lot of factions. So if Chaos Robbie can do it, then yes, I do believe that the team behind Creative Assembly should be able to do better than that. But then again, Creative Assembly is the kind of company that takes a mod idea and then just copy-pastes it without consideration for the fact that mods are built with certain limitations in mind and a lot of sacrifices and cut corners in mind. And compromises, rather, in mind. That's the problem with what Creative Assembly does. So they need to do better than what this map has. I mean, obviously, the overall layout of it, right, when we're talking about the shape of the world, that's one thing. But the scale of certain places. Now, would that make the map slow? Possibly, but I've always argued that they could just allow you as a player to disable certain areas. If you want to play with 300 factions, fair enough. But that's one of the things Old World allows you in a very compromised way that doesn't work perfectly, but it does allow you at least to disable a lot of portions of the campaign map there. And it's much better for it, or remove AI factions. Regardless, these are the key issues. So Autoresolve, especially with settlements, sieges, because they're not great, and the actual map itself, be it climate, design, pathing, faction placement, the fact that there's too many legendary lords too close to each other. Like, there's no buffer zone whatsoever. Like, I don't think, I'm not too fond of the idea of just constantly fighting minor factions, but you have literally, look at this situation, you have 4 legendary lords next to each other, and that's just the 4 I'm looking at. You actually have 5 with Krokar, 6 with Cetra. 6 with Cetra. There's only a bit of a buffer between them and Teclis, and then you have Kairos, then you have the movement, navigation with the Chaos Wasteland, so on and so forth. So lots of these small issues adding up on this map. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Stay tuned for more.